American spirit. President Trump delivering a big speech to factory workers about an hour from now, linking his tax cut plan to economic growth and jobs and promoting the benefits of Made in America. Welcome to a brand new hour of America's Newsroom. I'm Shana Breen, Made in America, and you are as well.
Yeah, indeed I am. Cincinnati, Ohio. Good Samaritan Hospital, 6th floor.
It's successful.
I'm Bill Hemmer. Good morning. The president's message: tax cuts will make U.S. companies more competitive, helping them create more jobs, and that's good for American workers. Vice President Mike Pence saying that tax cuts are exactly what companies need to help keep jobs here in the U.S. of A.
High business taxes have made it harder for Michigan companies to hire, to give raises, to invest in their employees' success. It literally killed jobs across the Midwest and caused companies to close factories and build them overseas. Folks, this can't continue. And under President Trump's leadership, those days are over.
Peter Ducey live on the Hill now. Does the administration think they will get help from Democrats in advancing this idea? Peter?
Not much, Bill. We just heard from the White House Budget Director Mick Mulvaney, who said that he thinks Democrats are going to start ignoring potential tax benefits so they can stick to talking points.
I think there's a couple Democrats that they've already checked out. In fact, I've had a conversation with some and I've asked them, could you ever support a reduction to the corporate tax rate? And they say no. Yes, we are reaching across the aisle to see if there's folks who are reasonable, who want to talk about what's good for the actual American economy and American families.
This morning, a Democratic Congressman, Seth Moulton, said on MSNBC he'd like to see a tax cut, but just for small businesses, not big ones. And that's as other Democrats, like Congressman Tim Ryan of Ohio, say that they're not against making tax brackets friendlier. They just want guarantees that reforms will benefit business workers and business owners alike.
I want to give a $1 trillion expansion to working class families who are making $75,000 or $100,000 a year. Those are the people that needed help, and I will tell you that those are the people that voted for Donald Trump.
The Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan, says he thinks tax reform can get done this year and that it has to achieve the 3% GDP growth that they are targeting next year. The Speaker also insists that any kind of a tax package, once it is actually written into law, would not add to the deficit. Bill.
Republicans need a victory. Do we know if voters share the enthusiasm for tax reform? What do the polls suggest on that, Peter?
They do share enthusiasm, Bill, but that doesn't mean that tax reform is their top priority. There's a brand new Fox News poll out last night that shows 52% of voters say it's extremely important for Congress to pass tax reform, but that's a lot less than the 58% who say health care reform must be taken care of, and the 62% who say the Dreamer Law must be passed. So there is a shared sense of urgency, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the priorities are all in order here versus outside of here.
Thank you, Peter. Good to have you back on the Hill. Peter Ducey there. Here's Shannon.
All right, for more on this, let's bring in Chris Wallace, anchor of Fox News Sunday. By the way, a special time this week at 8 a.m. We want to make sure folks know that. Good morning, Chris.
Good morning to you, Shannon. Yeah, we got a football game before us, so we are on at 8 and 7 and 6 and 5. But you can also watch us, of course, on the Fox News channel in the afternoon and evening.
And we will, and you'll have plenty to talk about, including this push for tax reform. Interesting piece by Kimberly Strassel in the Wall Street Journal talking about the trouble that may be ahead. And she says it's not about policy, it's about just never Trumpers. Here's what she says. The media has treated the trio's excuses, and here she's talking about Collins, McCain, and Paul, and says treated their excuses for killing the party's top priority as legitimate. Here about health care, despite the obvious holes in their objections over policy and process. What in fact binds the three is their crafting of identities based primarily on opposition to their party or Mr. Trump. This matters because it bodes very ill for tax reform in the Senate. Overcoming policy objections is one thing, overcoming egos is another. Chris?
Well, look, I respect the heck out of Kimberly Strassel, and I think she's usually right on. I can't say I agree with this. She's talking specifically about Rand Paul and John McCain and Susan Collins. And they all voted against the president repeatedly and against these bills when it came to health care repeal and replace. But I'm not sure that this extends to tax reform in several cases there. I mean, for instance, Rand Paul. Rand Paul made it very clear right from the start that he wanted to repeal Obamacare. He said that's what we campaigned on, the Republicans did, and that's what we need to do. And you could certainly argue that the Graham-Cassidy bill did not repeal Obamacare. In fact, it kept almost all the taxes hundreds of billions of dollars in taxes and then just gave it to the states, kept a lot of the structure of Obamacare. So, you know, I'm not sure that it was just ego or even primarily ego in the case of Rand Paul. A lot of people would say it was conviction. Same with Susan Collins. Susan Collins, of course, was very concerned about Medicaid and how it would affect people in her state. You know, I think people make a decision based on, one, their campaign convictions, what they have said over the course of campaigning and being in office, and also how they think it's going to affect people in their state.
You predict smoother sailing now for the tax reform package. They got to get to the budget first. They're going to do that. But with that lined up, do you see Democratic buy-in? Do you think this is going to be a partisan vote?
I think it's going to be a pretty partisan vote. And obviously the fact that Republicans are trying to do it the same way they did health care through budget reconciliation is an indication, because that means you only need 51 votes, that certainly in the Senate they don't think they're going to get much Democratic buy-in, and so therefore they figure they're going to have to do it just with the Republicans. Look, Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi have made it very clear. One, they do not want a tax bill that adds to the deficit. This one almost certainly will. Republicans say, well, growth is going to pay for it. I got to tell you, you go back to the Reagan tax cuts, which I covered in the early 80s. You go back to the Bush tax cuts in the early 2000s. You can argue whether it was good economic policy or not. They did not pay for themselves. The deficit increased in both cases. And then the other question is that Schumer and Pelosi are talking about, who does it benefit? And at least as it's written so far, it may change, but as it's written so far, the benefit to the top earners seems more clear than the benefit to the middle class. You've got an end to the estate tax, an end to the alternative minimum tax, although they're saying that might change. And then you've also got a reduction from 39.6% to 35% in the tax rate. That may change also, but as it stands right now, top earners have a clearer benefit from this than middle class income people do.
And while the president's going to head out today for another speech on tax reform, and they want that to be the focus, they've got this other issue with HHS Secretary Tom Price. He spoke with Brett about this furor over his private flights and how he wants to repay at least part of the money. Here's part of what he said about that playing out.
He's talked about it, and as he has said publicly, he wasn't happy, and he expressed that to me very clearly. I look forward to regaining the trust that the American people, some of the American people, may have lost in the activities that I took, and to not only regain the trust of the American people, but gain the trust of the administration and the president.
What's your take, Chris, on whether he retains his position?
Well, I think it's going to be tough because, for instance, those charter flights domestically cost about $400,000. He's reimbursing the government only for his seat, not all the security, all the aides that were there as a result of the fact that he took a private flight. So he's paying $50,000 for a cost that it was incurred was $400,000. Now it's turning out that he took some international flights, and that may be another $500,000. Look, Donald Trump gets upset with cabinet members, Jeff Sessions being the best example, doesn't necessarily mean they're gone. But, boy, when he was on the South Lawn heading to the Marine One to go off on a trip this week, he looked like he was really ticked about Tom Price and his tremendous expenditure of money on these private charter flights. We'll have to see whether he gets over that or not. As Price pointed out in his interview with Bret Baier yesterday, he serves at the pleasure of the president, and at least for now, the president doesn't seem very pleased.
We'll ask Kellyanne Conway about that coming up in just a few minutes. In the meantime, we will see you 8 o'clock on Sunday morning, Chris.
Don't rub it in, Shannon.
It's a little bit earlier. It's going to be great. You're going to sit down with OMB Director Mick Mulvaney, 2 o'clock and 10 o'clock Eastern on Fox News Channel. Again, check those local listings. It's going to be earlier because it is Football Sunday.
We will be
Thanks,
there.
Chris.
See you, Chris.
Thanks, guys.
On Sunday. All right, now the threat of a subpoena from the Senate Judiciary Committee Chair Chuck Grassley is now upon us. The Iowa senator wants to speak to 2 FBI officials about a number of topics, including Russia, the firing of James Comey, and the Hillary Clinton email case. That's a lot, right? Chief Intelligence Correspondent Catherine Herridge breaking all that down live in Washington. Catherine.
Well, thank you, Bill. The senator wants a private closed-door interview with FBI officials Carl Gaddis and James Rybicki. Gaddis is the executive assistant director of the FBI's National Security Division. Rybicki is the chief of staff and a former senior counselor to FBI Director James Comey. The assistant attorney general wrote to Grassley 2 weeks ago and blocked the interviews on the basis they would likely interfere with the special counsel Russia probe. But Grassley says his questions do not present a conflict because he wants to ask officials about improper political influence or bias in the Justice Justice Department, the firing of FBI Director James Comey, and the Clinton email investigation, as well as the FBI's activities that relate to President Trump, his associate, and Russia's interference in the 2016 election. And as you mentioned, subpoenas are on the table in this case, Bill.
The committee's grown frustrated, right, with the former Trump campaign. Why?
Well, on the Hill, the Senate Judiciary Committee leadership made clear that their patience has basically run out with Paul Manafort, who first agreed to be interviewed by Senate investigators in July, but it was canceled after the FBI raided his Virginia home the morning Manafort was scheduled to appear before the committee. The ranking Democrat, as well as the Republican chairman, indicated to reporters late yesterday that a subpoena is likely on its way, and this does set up the possibility of a conflict with the special counsel, because Manafort is the subject of the special counsel investigation, and based on widespread reports, he is likely to be indicted in this case. And the special counsel would not be of a mind to have him appear in a separate venue like the Senate Judiciary Committee, because then they have different pots of information and it could complicate any prosecution, Bill.
Wow. Okay, Catherine, keep us posted on all that.
You're welcome.
A lot to watch. Catherine Herrick there in D.C. Shannon.
Breaking news on the ISIS front. New audio recordings now surfacing, said to be from the leader of the terrorist organizations, 11 months after Russia said he was dead. The new threats he's issuing now, plus...
They're in our prayers. As the president said, we are with the people of Puerto Rico. The president and first lady will be traveling there early next week. He's asked me and my wife Karen to travel later in the week. And as he's made clear, we're going to be there every step of the way.
Well, that shows you the White House doubling down on efforts to get aid out to hurricane victims in Puerto Rico. Still taking a lot of heat for the handling of this crisis, so we'll let you know what's happening on that in a moment.
Meanwhile, the president continues his push for tax reform in a speech he's about to give an hour from now or so. But first, the president's senior counselor, Kellyanne Conway, is here. We'll get a response to all these stories next.
Fox News moments ago confirming that the U.S. will be warning American travelers not to visit Cuba after concern about those mysterious sonic attacks against Americans in Havana. The embassy ordering 60% of the staff to leave the country due to these specific attacks on diplomats. And apparently the government in Cuba is working with the Americans to figure out who's responsible and why it happened. But a lot of this right now is still a mystery. So stay tuned. More information on that when we get it.
President Trump defending his response to the Puerto Rican crisis. He and the vice president will both be visiting that devastated U.S. territory next week. The Pentagon also appointing a three-star general to get there and oversee the recovery effort. FEMA has also been on the ground sending water and supplies and much more. Thousands of workers there. Senior counselor to the president, Kellyanne Conway, joins me to talk about that and much more. Good morning, Kellyanne.
Good morning, Shannon.
Okay, so there is a three-star general going in, and there have been many calls for the military to get more involved. Some of the criticism comes from the general who was appointed to oversee Katrina efforts. And here's what he says, quote, "It's kind of like Katrina. We got it. We got it. Oh, blank, send in the cavalry. This is a hit on White House decision making." Your response?
My response would be to echo the comments of our Homeland Security and Counterterrorism advisor here at the White House, Tom Bossert, who said in an interview earlier today in response to that same observation that he served with that general when it came to Katrina, but that the general is not read into this entire situation. The fact is there are 10,000 federal employees on the ground, including 800 from FEMA. Fortunately, Shannon, a lot of the commodities that are necessary, the millions of meals and liters of water and medicines are there. The supplies are there. It's a matter of distributing them on an island whose infrastructure, emergency contact have been completely destroyed and need to be rebuilt. And there's a lot of debris clearing going on. So it's a matter of the delivery system at this point. Everybody is working as hard as they can. I'm sorry very much that there are certain people, particularly on TV, trying to politicize this. Hurricane always trying to find a way to blame the president for things when they do much better to figure out how to help. Anybody who wants to help, it's nvoad.gov. Go onto the website. You can help as a volunteer. Find out what you can do instead of complaining about it. But the fact is, the commodities are there. Jet travel is restored. Most of the hospitals across Puerto Rico, not all, are now back up and running. But it is a process. There's a process in place to help rebuild the infrastructure. The power grids are still down. We want to make sure people have access to clean water, to the food supplies, and fuel, of course, is very important to the people of Puerto Rico. But this president, this vice president, the entire administration are responding with a full force and effect, as our military. And yesterday, the waiver of the Jones Act, I think, helps a great deal in that regard as well.
What do you make of GOP Senator Marco Rubio calling for more military intervention? He says the situation as you describe it, and we've seen the pictures, the infrastructure is decimated. He says he thinks the U.S. military is the only thing that can get in there and get these things distributed, and he's calling on a much bigger presence from our troops.
Well, I'm told that, again, by the officials in charge of this recovery and rebuilding effort, Shannon, that that is being done, and that we have a very big and expanded footprint there already, including our military, and that will increase as it is appropriate to go. In other words, I know everybody has said this, but it bears repeating that you can't drive trucks just over contiguous borders. Puerto Rico is about 1,100 miles away from the closest, I think, contiguous state, and you've got people coming in through air, through land. There have been some airdrops, obviously, of supplies that are needed. But the fact that Puerto Rico is an island doesn't mean it's an island alone. And we are there for them. Very much appreciate the work of Senator Rubio and others who have been on the ground, others trying to help the populations here at home who want to know how their relatives are doing and their friends are doing on the territory of Puerto Rico. But this is an administration-wide effort. Puerto Rico was hit by 2 hurricanes in very short order, Irma and Maria. And this is devastation on a scale that I think the island has never seen or has not seen, at least in our lifetime. So everybody's working very deftly. And again, I can't help but see so much of this as criticism of the president. One day it's about X, the other day it's Y, the next day it's about a hurricane. And it's just, it really is too bad that people who, sure, their job is to be skeptical and probing, become cynical about something when the president and the vice president administration, indeed, and our military, our brave men and women in the military, are trying to help those in need. I would invite those people to add to the aid and assistance rather than the criticism and the cacophony.
Yeah, and our huge thanks to all of those who are there on the ground, volunteers and paid and military, all of them in this difficult situation. Meanwhile, about an hour from now, the president is going to speak about tax reform. How confident are you it can get done by the end of the year?
Yes, I'll be accompanying the president this morning to his speech to the National Association of Manufacturers. And I think in that speech, the president will lay out what's already happened economically that doesn't get enough coverage. The S&P is at a historic high. The GDP growth for last quarter just came out last night. To confirm, is 3.1%. That's amazing. I mean, this is something that candidate Trump talked about on the campaign trail, Shannon, that we should not just give in and give up on a 2% growth rate. Before 2007, for decades, this country enjoyed more than a 3% growth rate. The president already achieved that in the last quarter, and his tax plan assumes that we can get up to 3.5%, 4%. He's going to also tell these manufacturers they can invest. They're going to have 100% of expensing of their capital improvements. We're going to reduce the brackets. And for businesses to go to 20%, that's going to spur growth. Change. That's right. It's going to be a massive change for consumers and employees.
We got to leave it there. Unfortunately, we're out of time. Kellyanne, we appreciate yours.
Thank you for having me. Congratulations on the new show. Thank you.
Thanks. See you at 11.
Nicely done.
Got it.
In a moment here, should the Iran deal be ripped up? The case with Jack Keane. Next. Breaking news yet again here. ISIS leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi reemerging 11 months after the Russians claimed he was killed in an airstrike. Al-Baghdadi calling for new attacks against the West and referencing North Korea's threats against the U.S. and Japan, which may be an indication about a time reference, and the Pentagon tells us they're examining that tape now. A retired 4-star General Jack Keane, Fox News military analyst and former Vice Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army. Sir, how are you? And welcome back here.
Doing well, Bill. Good to see you.
America's Newsroom. Here is one of his quotes: "Besiege them in every corner," Baghdadi apparently says. The Christians and the Kurdish infidels are too despicable and disgraceful to stand against you. When their Crusader Air Force were absent for 1 hour, soldiers of Islam and supporters of the Caliphate everywhere, intensify your hits and target the infidels' media centers. It goes on for like 35 minutes. His big point: he's trying to tell his fighters that America and Europe and Russia feel threatened and terrorized by their actions. How do you interpret this latest move and the fact that there seems to be proof of life?
Well, certainly, I mean, it comes down to verifying his voice. I think our intel agencies would probably be able to do that if they haven't done that already. Certainly, his referencing to current events seems to suggest that who's ever talking on that tape obviously is alive. And I think that the Pentagon was absolutely right in when the Russians said they killed him, and the Pentagon says we're not doing that till we see proof of death. and we never had proof of death. So now it seems we have proof of life. And I think what he's trying to do is he knows Raqqa is going to fall pretty soon. By the way, he and his leaders have left Raqqa, the city in northern Syria that we're attacking, which was their safe haven, and they have fled to the southeastern part of the Euphrates River Valley, south of a town called Deir Zor, and that's where he and his leaders are spread out in a number of villages there. Likely, don't know for certain, but that's kind of where they are. And I think, you know, he's trying to inspire and motivate the leaders that are out there. And listen, since 2014, they have attacked NATO countries 38 times. 9 NATO countries to include the United States. So, I mean, they are still out there, and obviously, given what we've seen this last year, they are likely to continue to do harm.
Well, on Iran, I just want to squeeze this in because I don't know if you agree with Ambassador Bolton or not, but he's got a strong op-ed out. Here's what he writes. The Ayatollahs are using Mr. Obama's handiwork to legitimize their terrorist state, facilitate and conceal their continuing nuclear weapons and ballistic missile programs, and acquire valuable resources for gullible negotiating partners. Mr. Trump's real decision is whether to fulfill his campaign promise to extricate America from this strategic debacle, end quote. He called it an embarrassment at the UN. Should he cut and leave or not? General?
I think what the Trump team... Listen, they don't like the deal. The president has said that during the campaign, and he certainly just said it recently at the UN, as you noted. I think what they're trying to do, before they cut out of it, as Ambassador Bolton suggests, they're trying to fix it. You know, the sunset clause where they're going to be able to spin centrifuges and enrich uranium in 10 years on the way to a nuclear weapon, they want to fix that. I think it's unlikely to be able to get it fixed, but they're going to try. The second thing is they want access to the military bases that are now closed off, and Ambassador Bolton talks about that, because that's likely where the secret stuff is going on. We know the Iranians have always cheated. We know they're cheating right now, despite what the IAEA is saying, because it's going on in places they don't have access to. And I think if they can't accomplish those fixes, they'll likely walk.
Wow. Thank you, General. To be picked up another day, Jack Keane there live in Washington, 29 minutes past the hour. Shannon, what's next?
Well, the cat in the hat, not welcome in one little local school library. Why the librarian there rejected the First Lady's donation of Dr. Seuss books. Plus, what the White House is saying about the snub now. And there's this.
The left has hijacked this game. It used to be a respite. It used to be a place you go to escape. It is just incredible to watch the talent that's on display. And to watch them now get caught up into something that I don't even think they understand.
So that's Rush Limbaugh from Sean Hannity's interview. The NFL looking for a resolution before Sunday. Bernie Goldberg, Jim Gray on deck as the controversy continues. Last night, NFL players standing, locking arms during the national anthem. Green Bay, Wisconsin, Lambeau Field, Bears and Packers.
And the home of the brave.
So that was the scene at Lambeau Field. Some players locking arms on the field, in the stands, shouts of USA. With me now, sportscaster Jim Gray, Fox News contributor. First, I want to start with Bernie Goldberg, and also a Fox News contributor, to talk about last night. And also, Bernie, good morning to you. I want to play a little clip from Rush Limbaugh last night with Sean Hannity, and he characterizes this, well, the battle between right and left on the NFL controversy the following way.
The owners and the commissioner, I don't know what their individual politics are. I don't think they understand what's happening to them. I don't think they understand what's going on. They think they're relating to the majority of their fan base. They're not. They're driving them away, and I hate it. I don't want the NFL to get smaller. I don't want it to become insignificant. I don't want it to be taken over by a bunch of wusses.
Yeah, the point he's making there, he believes the left is trying, in a political sense, trying to overtake the NFL and do great damage to it. In a general sense, what did you think of the point he was making there, Bernie?
Yeah, I agree with Rush, but only to this extent. Look, if the players think that there's a moral issue or if they perceive racial injustice, they should protest. But I agree with the rest of what Rush said, that optics matter. And when they protest on the field and take a knee during the national anthem, even if they don't mean to disrespect the American flag, it looks like that. But here's what Rush, who is very bright and is very articulate, obviously on both counts, here's what he won't say, because ideological purists can't or won't hold two opposing ideas in their head at the same time. Here's what Rush won't say. Colin Kaepernick started this. He's wrong. He picked the wrong venue. But Rush is also wrong for taking a little bonfire and pouring gasoline on it and turning it into a raging inferno, which he needlessly did in his speech in Alabama. He didn't have to do that. And it's not the first time he's done this. He did it out of the blue, out of nowhere, with transgenders in the military. Healthcare is going nowhere. Repeal and replace. Who knows what the special counsel is going to do? So Donald Trump figures, you know what? The American people are going to be on my side on this. And they are on his side in terms of the fundamental issue of kneeling during the anthem. But they are not on his side when he calls the players SOBs and says they should be fired. So what is the President of the United States, what has he really accomplished? He's made us more divisive. He didn't start the fire. I want to emphasize that. Colin Kaepernick started the fire, but Rush Limbaugh poured gasoline on it.
The league to make a call on this, too. Quickly, Bernie, Aaron Rodgers asked the fans to lock arms last night. I didn't see a lot of that going on in Lambeau Field. And he talked about this issue being about equality. And equality over what? Because equality, Bernie, has taken on this massively broad definition.
Exactly. Yeah. I think we're going to see more protests like this, at least for a while. But make no mistake, these protests now are really not about perceived racial inequality or rogue cops shooting people. These are protests against Donald Trump. That's what they're about. And if there were other protests, if some other player said, you know what, I think the real cause of inequality, much greater than white racism, is fatherlessness in America, especially in black America. Do you think the media would turn those protesters into heroes the way they've turned?
We debated that during the last week, too. Quickly, and I got to get the Jim here.
Yeah. Well, they wouldn't turn those protesters into heroes the way they've turned these protesters into heroes, because certain protests are acceptable in our liberal culture, and certain protests are not acceptable.
Bernie, thanks for that. I want to turn to Jim Gray right now. Jim, Bernie is saying this is going to go on for some time. I'm not so sure. I think last night was an indication the league has figured it out. There was a big meeting in New York this week. A lot of owners took part in it. Players took part in it. The whole locking of the arms, gets you to stand, gets you on the field, and you don't kneel. What do you think of that?
Yes, and that meeting took place with several owners and players, and what came out of the meeting is this cannot be the NFL against President Trump. We need to move beyond that. So if you want to use your platform for social justice, we will help you with some of those causes, and we will come together and unite. But kneeling for the national anthem, 55% of America says they do not like this and are very unhappy. But I want to point out something to you, Bill, that's very ironic. I had a conversation yesterday with Mark Davis, the owner of the Oakland Raiders. And if you look at every single player in the National Football League, they wear the helmet, on their helmet, the American flag. Take a look at the back of every player. And I can only find other two walks of life in America that has that. NASA astronauts and some in the military. So to say that NFL players and its owners are anti-American and anti-flag when they are required to wear it and do wear it and display it proudly, you know, this was a social justice thing, and Bernie just talked about it when the president called them out.
It's been a headache for the league.
It's a pretty interesting thing to see that, isn't it?
But
and it hasn't been pointed out.
For the owners or the commissioner, it's been a headache for them. They're trying to figure out how they solve this. What the NBA commissioner did yesterday, he came out and said, we're not going to do it. Everybody will stand for the national anthem. In that sense, the NBA is getting ahead of this before that season starts.
And they've had a policy in place, and the NFL did not have a policy in place. The policy has been that the commissioner has stated, we would like for you to stand up, but we don't require it. We would prefer that you do it. Well, that's not a policy. And so that's the difference here. Adam Silver in the NBA, going back to David Stern, has said, you'll stand for the national anthem or you'll be fined. And if you stay in the locker room, that's better, but you'll also be fined. And he reiterated that yesterday, and he was asked what will happen if an NBA player does take a knee. And Commissioner Silver said, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. And I don't expect that to happen. So that's a big difference here.
Yes,
and also, it wasn't called out by President Trump during the NBA season. So that's what has led, as Bernie said, to this massive demonstration last week. But I think you're going to see a large majority, if not all, there'll be a couple, I think they'll all stand up and lock arms this week.
I agree with you. I agree. Yeah.
It's a business, and
no doubt.
they share in 50% of the revenues, and the owners and the players recognize this hurts the business at the end of the day, and they share in the business.
Money talks. Thank you, Jim. Jim Gray, Bernie Goldberg before that.
Thanks,
Nice
Bill.
to have you back. Shanna.
Well, First Lady Melania Trump donates children's books to a school and gets a big no thanks from the librarian who raises the issue of racism. How the White House is responding.
That's the librarian's prerogative. I support a decision.
I thought it was a very well-crafted message back to the White House.
I think she's trying to help the First Lady really understand where help is needed and how to offer the help.
First Lady Melania Trump donating 10 Dr. Seuss books to a school in Massachusetts. But the school's librarian rejected the gesture, sending a letter thanking Mrs. Trump for the book, saying our school doesn't need them, and offering her some advice that a lot of people think reads like a dig. The First Lady's office has responded. So let's talk about it. Joining me now, Fox News contributor, syndicated radio host Leslie Marshall, and Fox News contributor Rachel Campos-Duffy. Welcome to both of you.
Good morning,
Thank you.
Shannon.
All right, I want to read a little bit of this letter so people have context, and this is online. Reportedly, the letter from the librarian, she says in part, you may not be aware of this, but Dr. Seuss is a bit of a cliche, a tired and worn ambassador for children's literature. As First Lady of the United States, you have an incredible platform. Why not go out of your way to gift books to underfunded and underprivileged communities that continue to be marginalized and maligned by policies put in place by Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos? You and your husband have a direct impact on these children's lives. Please make time to learn about and value them. Rachel?
I mean, this is just incredible. There was an article or an op-ed this week in the Wall Street Journal that said the politicization of everything. Indeed, a beautiful letter written by the First Lady with free books to the children, by the way. I don't even know if it was hers to reject or return. These were a gift to the children. But look, everything is political these days. And I think it's a warning to parents that, you know, parenting is not a spectator sport anymore. They're not just trying to indoctrinate our children in colleges. They're doing it at the elementary level. And you can't assume that, you know, your kids are getting classic literature. She also provided, by the way, your readers should read this letter. Please Google it. It's absolutely an unbelievable letter. Dr. Seuss is racist. News to me. I've been reading it for, 17 years now to my 8 kids. We need to actually stop this silliness. It's gotten to the point of insanity, really.
Okay, the First Lady's office, Stephanie Grisham, her communications director, has responded, Leslie, saying turning the gesture of sending young school children books into something divisive is unfortunate, but the First Lady remains committed to her efforts on behalf of children everywhere. What do you make of this situation?
Well, first of all, I'm from Boston, and I have to say anybody from Boston knows Cambridgeport. It's an extremely wealthy, extremely intellectual community. You're talking Cambridge is the home of Harvard, of MIT, where people don't just have high school diplomas and bachelor's degrees. They have numerous PhDs and 7 to 10 letters after their names. I love Dr. Seuss. My kids read it. I have it at home right now on their bookshelves. However, one of the things I would agree with is this is not an area that needs any donations. This is an extremely wealthy area, and there are books being given by Ivy League universities and private schools and people that have 7-digit paychecks to do that. Quite frankly, although the librarian did make it political, she's within her right. And what I thought was more ridiculous was that the First Lady would even bother to respond. I dare say Laura Bush, a Republican former First Lady who was a librarian, I don't think she would have responded at all. I think she simply would have said, okay,
Leslie,
I'll send the books elsewhere, and moved on.
Leslie, can I ask you, do you think that librarian would have returned those books had they been donated, say, by First Lady Michelle Obama? Do you really believe that that would have happened? Or that she would have sent such a condescending, mean, rude letter?
Well, she may